Today, we're going to tackle a pretty heated topic. Should we just do away with the Department of Education altogether?
Big question, right?
Huge, right? And you guys have sent in some fascinating stuff. A policy memo and a legislative brief, both making the case for basically taking education out of the hands of the federal government and putting it back in the hands of states and communities.
And it's a really compelling case. It's gaining traction fast, especially among parents and teachers who feel like the system is failing their kids.
Yeah, the memo comes out swinging right from the start. It basically says that decades of federal oversight haven't done a thing to solve the problem of educational inequity. And they actually used this huge federal program that pumps billions of dollars into schools in low-income areas as a prime example.
The idea is to level the playing field.
Right, but the memo argues that it just hasn't worked. The achievement gap between affluent and disadvantaged students is basically the same as it was decades ago.
Yeah, and in some cases, it's even gotten worse.
And what's even more frustrating is that a lot of that money never even makes it to the classroom.
You're telling me it gets bogged down in bureaucracy, administrative costs, all that stuff?
So the memo is basically saying, okay, if the federal government can't fix this, maybe it's time to try something different. What if we shifted power away from Washington and gave more control to local communities?
That's the big idea, local control. Right.
The thinking is that local authorities are closer to the communities they serve, so they're better equipped to understand the challenges and the opportunities and come up with solutions that actually work.
It makes sense, right? I mean, a community with a large immigrant population might need to focus on ESL programs, while a rural district might prioritize vocational training to prepare students for jobs in their area.
So it's about tailoring education to the specific needs of each community.
One size fits all doesn't work when it comes to education.
I get that. But doesn't this raise some red flags? Like, wouldn't giving more power to local communities just lead to even bigger disparities? I mean, we already see huge differences in funding and resources between school districts.
Yeah, that's a valid concern for sure. And it's something that the memo addresses head on. They're not saying that local control is a perfect solution,
Right.
but they do argue that it at least creates a mechanism for addressing those disparities more effectively.
Okay, so how would that work?
Well, think about it. Right now, if a school district is struggling, they have to go through all these bureaucratic hoops to get help from the federal government. With local control, communities would have more direct influence over their schools.
More accountability.
Parents could put pressure on school boards. Voters could hold elected officials accountable. Local philanthropists could invest directly in their communities.
So it's about creating a system where everyone has skin in the game.
And where people are empowered to make changes.
I'm starting to see the logic here. Well, what about standards? I mean, if we ditch the federal government, who's going to make sure that kids are learning what they need to know?
The memo argues that we need to move away from this obsession with standardized testing.
Oh boy, here we go.
They call it a straitjacket on learning.
I kind of like that.
And I think a lot of parents would agree. They argue that standardized tests have narrowed the curriculum, forcing teachers to teach to the test instead of fostering a love of learning.
And it's true. I mean, how many of us spent hours drilling math formulas and memorizing historical dates without really understanding why any of it mattered?
And the memo points out that there are other countries like Finland that have achieved amazing educational outcomes without relying on standardized tests.
So what are they proposing instead?
They suggest a shift towards more holistic forms of assessment, things like portfolios, project-based learning, student-led exhibitions.
So instead of filling in bubbles on a multiple choice test, kids would be demonstrating their learning through real-world projects.
And it allows for a much richer understanding of a student's capabilities than a single test score could ever provide.
So we've talked about equity and testing. Let's move on to another big issue, workforce readiness. The memo takes aim at the Department of Education's laser focus on STEM fields.
Right, they're saying it's too narrow.
They argue that it's created this pipeline that undervalues other important areas of study like the arts, humanities, skilled trades.
It's like we're saying the only path to success is through science and technology.
But what about all the other amazing things that kids can do? What about the artists, the writers, the musicians, the craftspeople? We need well-rounded individuals who can think critically, who can solve problems, who can communicate effectively.
Who can create beauty, who can connect with the human experience.
And the memo argues that this overemphasis on STEM might actually be hurting our workforce in the long run.
How so?
Well, it's producing graduates who are technically proficient, but lacking in the soft skills that are so essential for success in today's world.
Things like collaboration, communication, adaptability.
Exactly. And in a world that's constantly changing, those skills are more important than ever.
So what's the alternative? If we're not just preparing students for specific jobs, what are we preparing them for?
The memo suggests that the answer lies in cultivating a more well-rounded individual.
What does that even mean?
It means nurturing critical thinking skills, fostering creativity and problem-solving abilities, instilling a sense of civic responsibility, encouraging a lifelong love of learning. So how do we get there? What are the concrete steps we can take to move away from this broken system and create something better? That's where that legislative brief comes in. Let's dive into that and see what kind of solutions they're proposing.
This is where the rubber meets the road.
So this brief really gets into the nuts and bolts of how to actually dismantle this centralized system. And like we were saying, it seems like it's failing so many students.
Yeah, it's not just about tearing down the old system. It's about building something new, something better, something that puts students first, you know?
Right.
And they start by laying out this really bold vision for how to decentralize education.
Yep.
They're calling for a shift in power away from the federal Department of Education and giving more autonomy to states and local communities.
That's a pretty huge change from how things work now.
Yeah,
I mean, the Department of Education, they have their hands in almost every aspect of education.
for sure.
From curriculum standards to funding to teacher training. I mean, are they really suggesting we just like get rid of all that?
Not completely. They
Yeah.
do say that there's still a role for the federal government, like when it comes to ensuring that all students have equal access to education.
Right.
But they argue that this top-down system that we have now with all the mandates and bureaucracy, it's actually stifling innovation and holding back progress.
So it's not about abolishing the Department of Education altogether. It's more about redefining its role.
Yeah, exactly.
And giving more control to the people who are actually on the ground.
Yeah.
In the schools and communities.
The people who are closest to the students.
Okay, so less federal micromanaging, more local decision-making.
But doesn't that bring up those same concerns about disparities that we talked about before? If every community is kind of left to figure things out on their own, won't that just create a patchwork of totally different educational experiences?
That's the big worry, right? But the brief makes a really strong argument for why local control, even though it's not perfect, could actually be a better way to deal with those disparities. So first of all, the brief points out that this system that we have now, despite all the good intentions, has absolutely failed to close the achievement gap.
We've been throwing money at the problem for decades, but the disparities are still there.
So it's like that saying, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results.
It's the definition of insanity.
Right.
So something needs to change.
Yeah.
And the brief argues that by giving more power to local communities, we're creating a system that can respond better to the needs of each community. It allows parents, teachers, and local leaders to come together and say, hey, this is what our kids need to succeed. This is how we want to use our resources. This is the kind of education system we want to build.
But let's be real here. Not every community has the same resources or expertise. I mean, some communities might have a really hard time making effective changes, even if they really want to.
That's true. And the brief acknowledges that there will be challenges, but it argues that we need to trust in the ability of local communities to be creative and solve problems. It suggests providing support and resources to help communities build their capacity, but ultimately it's about empowering people to take charge of their schools and their children's education.
It's kind of scary to think about such a big change from the way things have always been done. But I can see how it could potentially lead to a more dynamic and responsive education system.
One of the biggest criticisms of the current system is that it tries to serve this mythical average student who doesn't actually exist. Local control would allow for a more individualized approach, tailoring instruction to the unique strengths and challenges of each child.
It's about recognizing that kids aren't all the same. They're individuals with different needs, interests, and learning styles.
And by giving communities the power to create learning environments that are truly responsive to those individual needs, we might actually start to see some real progress in closing the achievement gap.
We discussed getting rid of standardized testing, but what would that look like in reality? How do we know if students are learning in a decentralized system?
Well, the brief lays out some really cool alternatives to standardized testing, and it emphasizes something called authentic assessment.
Instead of those bubble sheets and high-stakes exams that just stress everyone out, what are they suggesting?
They're pushing for things like project-based learning, where students have to tackle real-world problems and actually use their knowledge. You can imagine a classroom where students are designing a community garden or building a robot or writing and performing a play. These are hands-on experiential learning opportunities that allow students to show what they know in a much deeper and more authentic way than any standardized test ever could.
That's a far cry from the way most of us experience school, sitting in rows, filling out worksheets, memorizing facts and figures.
It is, and the brief argues that this kind of shift isn't just about making learning more fun. It's about preparing students for the demands of the 21st century workforce.
How so?
Well, think about the skills that employers are looking for these days. Being able to think critically, solve problems creatively, work collaboratively, and communicate effectively. These are the skills that are developed through project-based learning, through hands-on experiences, through authentic assessments that let students demonstrate their learning in real-world situations.
It's like we've been stuck in this outdated model of schooling for way too long, and it's time to move on. We need to prepare our kids for a world that's constantly changing.
And that's exactly what this legislative brief is all about. It's about shifting the whole paradigm, moving away from a system that values standardization and conformity, and towards one that embraces individuality, creativity, and the pursuit of knowledge.
But what about this whole issue of workforce readiness? We talked about how the memo criticized the Department of Education's focus on STEM fields. Does this brief offer any alternatives?
It does, and it's pretty interesting. It argues that instead of trying to force every student into a narrow STEM pipeline, we should be focusing on developing a broader set of skills and competencies that will be valuable in any field. And the brief goes on to propose some specific policy changes that could help make this shift towards a more holistic approach to education happen.
Okay, let's hear them. What are some of the key recommendations?
Well, one of the biggest ones is to drastically reduce the role of the federal government in setting curriculum standards and telling schools how to operate. Instead, they suggest giving more power to states and local communities to design curricula that meet the specific needs of their students and their local economies.
So instead of having a all-national curriculum, we'd have a more diverse and responsive system where communities can customize their educational programs to their own unique strengths and opportunities.
For instance, a rural community with a big agricultural industry might choose to emphasize vocational training in agriculture and natural resource management, while an urban community might focus on developing skills in technology design and entrepreneurship. We really dug deep into these policy ideas, looking at both what they could achieve and the potential problems.
But now I think we need to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Yeah, like what would this shift actually mean for society as a whole? What kind of future are we talking about if we really embrace this new approach to education? They say that by empowering local communities to take charge of their schools, we create a greater sense of responsibility and involvement in the community.
Education isn't just about preparing people for jobs. It's about preparing them to be citizens in a democracy.
And when people feel like they have a real say in the institutions that affect their lives, they're more likely to be invested in the well-being of their communities.
Because when people have the power to make decisions, they're more likely to find solutions that actually work.
And they're more likely to hold themselves and their leaders accountable for the results.
So it's not just about raising test scores or graduation rates. It's about building a more active and engaged citizenry.
Creating a culture of continuous improvement and adaptation.
Building a society where everyone has the chance to reach their full potential and contribute to the greater good.
That's a powerful vision. And I think it resonates with a lot of people who are frustrated with the current system.
People who are tired of seeing their kids forced into a one-size-fits-all mold.
People who want a system that values individuality, creativity, and critical thinking.
People who believe that education should be about more than just memorizing facts and passing tests.
It should be about preparing young people to be active, engaged, and informed citizens.
Citizens who can shape their own futures and contribute to the world around them.
And that's really what this whole debate is about. It's about the kind of future we want to create for ourselves and for the generations that come after us.
Do we want a future where education is just about controlling people and winning in the economy?
Or do we want a future where education is about freedom and giving people the power to make their own choices?
That's the choice we have to make. And it's a choice that we all have a part in.
Whether we're parents, educators, policymakers, or just concerned citizens.
We all have a stake in shaping the future of education.
And the future of our society.
Wow, this deep dive has been quite a journey.
We've covered so much ground, explored some really complex ideas, and faced some tough questions.
But I think we've come out of it with a better understanding of what's really important in this debate.
Let's keep pushing for change. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the heart of the education debate.
This is